Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u emisiju Granice istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Je li šerijatsko pravo kompatibilno sa međunarodnim ljudskim pravima i kakvi su odnosi religije i prava u muslimanskim zemljama? To su neka od najčešće postavljenih pitanja proteklih godina, naročito nakon napada 11. septembra 2001. godine. Nedavni slučaj Asije Bibi, pakistanske kršćanke koja je optužena na smrt zbog blasfemije i kasnije oslobođena presudom Vrhovnog suda, ponovno je privukao pažnju svjetske javnosti na tu temu. Prije razgovora sa našim gostima, pogledajmo uvodni prilog o slučaju Asije Bibi i zbog čega je bila optužena za blasfemiju.
Pakistanska kršćanka Asija Bibi je bila osuđena na smrtnu kaznu zbog vrijeđanja islama. Ipak presudu je poništio Vrhovni sud, a ona je puštena iz zatvora i prebačena na sigurnu lokaciju. Nakon oslobađajuće presude, deseci hiljada ljudi izašli su na ulice širom Pakistana, razočarani oslobađajućom presudom, zahtijevajući smrtnu kaznu. Pakistanske vlasti uhapsile su stotine ljudi osumnjičene za napad na policiju i vandalizam za vrijeme protesta protiv oslobađajuće presude. Gušenje protesta počelo je nakon što je pakistanski ministar unutrašnjih poslova naredio pokrajinskim vlastima i saveznim institucijama da preduzmu akciju protiv demonstranata koji su nasilni i uništavaju javnu i privatnu imovinu. Asijin suprug podnio je zahtjev za azil SAD-u i Velikoj Britaniji u ime cijele porodice. Advokat koji je na sudu branio Asiju i koji je i sam izbjegao iz Pakistana u strahu za život, zatražio je azil u Holandiji. Dvojica pakistanskih političara koji su pokušavali pomoći Asiji su proteklih godina ubijeni. Optužbe za blasfemiju protiv Bibi su podignute nakon incidenta 2009. u vezi s bokalom za vodu. Kako je rečeno na sudu, muslimanske radnice su odbile piti iz čaše iz koje je pila Asija, rekavši kako je ona kršćanka nečista. Nakon toga je izbila verbalna svađa između njih. Neki od muslimanskih žena koji su se posvađale s Asijom optužile su je da je izvrijeđala poslanika Muhameda, što je ona negirala. Godinu dana nakon toga osuđena je na smrt. Vrhovni sud Pakistana je potom donio oslobađajuću presudu, utvrdivši da je bilo mnogo kontradikcija u ranijim iskazima svjedoka i proceduralnih grešaka tužilaštva, te je zaključilo da su zapravo muslimanske žene, vrijeđajući Isusa Krista i vjeru kojoj pripada Asija, počinile ništa manje blasfemično djelo. Optužbe za blasfemiju česte su u Pakistanu, čak tvrdnje bez adekvatnih dokaza za vrijeđanje islama završavaju smrću linčovanjem. Najmanje 74 osobe su ubijene na takav način od 1990. godine. Trenutno 40 ljudi iščekuje smrtne kazne u Pakistanu pod optužbom za blasfemiju.
Blasfemija, odnosno vrijeđanje svetinja, i apostazija ili odricanje od vjere smatraju se krivičnim djelima u nekim zemljama svijeta. Pogledajmo i u kojim. Detaljnije o odnosima šerijatskog prava i međunarodnih ljudskih prava pojašnjava nam Yasser Abdelrahim, profesor islamskih nauka na Univerzitetu u Erfurtu. Dr. Yasser Abdelrahim, hello and welcome to Al Jazeera Balkans. Now, one of the never-ending debates in both Muslim and non-Muslim countries is the compatibility of Islamic law with international human rights. What exactly lies at the crux of the problem?
This question is very, very complicated and is very debatable in Western circles and also in Islamic circles. We have different views or different answers to your questions. There is a view which says that Islam is compatible with international human rights. A second view says that human rights will be fully realized under Islamic law. A third view says that human rights are a Western idea and is an expression of Western hegemony that should be rejected. Another view says that human rights are not compatible with Islam. And another view says that international human rights objective has an anti-religious agenda. So, as you see, we have different views, we have different answers to your questions. But I think that, generally speaking, human rights, international human rights, are compatible with Islam. If we speak about the aims and the philosophy of human rights, what are the philosophy and the aims of human rights? And let us speak about the aims and of the Sharia. What are the purposes? What are the basic intents?
The higher objectives.
The high objectives of the Sharia. They are very similar. The aim and the philosophy of the aim of human rights is the basic aim is the protection of the individual from the misuse of state authority, the protection of human dignity, the achievement of justice. Justice and human dignity, these principles are basic principles in the Sharia and in Islam. So they are compatible. They are compatible. Of course, there are perceptual differences between Islamic law and international human rights, but these differences don't make them incompatible. Let us refer to the basic intents of the Sharia. Muslim scholars in the Middle Ages mentioned 5 purposes as basic intents of the Sharia. What are these intents? The preservation of religion, حفظ الدين, the preservation of self, حفظ النفس, the preservation of mind, حفظ العقل, the preservation of offspring, حفظ النسل, and the preservation of property and wealth.
If Islamic law and international human rights have the same higher objectives, why do some conservative Muslim circles view human rights as a Western and alien concept?
The problem of some conservative Muslims is that they refuse human rights as an expression of Western hegemony. They think that human rights is an expression of a cultural invasion or a new form of cultural invasion, and it is directed also against Islam. But I don't think that most of them reject human rights per se, reject human rights as an idea. Because as said, human rights are, generally speaking, have the same goals and the same objectives like the Sharia. But some Muslim school or some conservative Muslims relate human rights to the principle of the separation church and state. And they think that the West would like to repeat its own experience with respect to the separation of state and religion, would like to repeat this experience in Muslim countries. And they think that the West intends to replace Islam by a kind of international ideology of humanity. So they think that it is directed against Islam, but in fact it is not.
Now, what exactly has gone wrong in Muslim majority countries, from being tolerant and pluralistic in the Middle Ages to becoming some of the worst violators of civil liberties today?
Muslim societies, and it is historically Muslim societies were more tolerant than Western societies in the Middle Ages. And Islam is a tolerant religion. But nowadays, we live in a period of weakness. And that is the problem of Muslims and the problem of Islamic countries. We live in a period of weakness. And because Muslims, or most Muslims, have the feeling that they have to defend their religions, they have to defend their Islamic identity and so on. And this motivates some extremists to exaggerate and to do some practices which are not acceptable by Islam itself. Mm-hmm. Or some governments, okay, the same. Some authoritarian governments, they use religion, they use Islam to serve their own interests, to serve their own authoritarian regimes.
Now, at one point in time, at the beginning of the 20th century, almost every Muslim majority country was under some form of European colonial rule.
Yes.
To what extent has colonialism impacted, and to what extent is it responsible for the current state of affairs of Muslim majority countries, especially in the Middle East, when it comes to civil liberties and authoritarian regimes?
Of course, the West is responsible for what happens nowadays in Islamic countries. And the Western hegemony, for example, if we speak about Egypt, Egypt was occupied by Great Britain after the so-called Renaissance, the Egyptian Renaissance in the 19th century, in the time of Muhammad Ali and his predecessors, and in the time of Ismail and other rulers of the family of Muhammad Ali. But during the British occupation, Egypt or this Renaissance stopped, or Egypt stopped to be a great regional power and was a state under the occupation. And after that, Western regimes supported the authoritarian regimes in our region because they thought that these regimes will maintain stability in the Arab region, and they close their eyes for human rights violations, just because these regimes will maintain stability.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Yasser, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Not at all. Thank you.
Poštovani gledalci, bio je to Yasser Abdelrahim, profesor sa Univerziteta u Erfurtu. A kakav status ima religija u ustavima zemalja širom svijeta, analiziramo u nastavku. Odnosi religije i države u svijetu su kompleksni i mogu se klasificirati u 4 kategorije. Zemlje koje imaju državnu religiju, zemlje koje dodjeljuju privilegiran status određenoj religiji, zemlje koje nemaju državnu religiju, niti dodjeljuju privilegiran status bilo kojoj religiji i zemlje koje su neprijateljski nastrojene prema religiji. Prema podacima Američkog istraživačkog centra Pew, više od 80 zemalja svijeta favorizira određenu religiju, bilo da je tretira kao zvaničnu ili poluzvaničnu religiju ili čak pružanjem određenih privilegija u poređenju sa ostalim religijama. Gledajući globalno, Islam je religija koja je u najvećem broju slučajeva uživa neku vrstu državne zaštite. U 27 zemalja svijeta Islam je proglašen državnom religijom, najviše na Bliskom istoku i sjeveru Afrike. 17 od 20 zemalja tog regiona imaju državnu religiju. Od tih 17, osim u Izraelu, u svim ostalim je Islam državna religija. Sudan i Sirija nemaju državnu religiju, ali Islamu dodjeljuju privilegiran status, dok je Liban jedina država regije koja nema državnu religiju niti preferiranu religiju. Poređenja radi, 13 zemalja svijeta, uključujući 9 evropskih zemalja, kršćanstvo proglašava državnom religijom. Uz navedeno, 40 država svijeta nezvanično favorizira određenu religiju, a kršćanstvo ima privilegiran tretman u čak 28 zemalja svijeta. Jedna od svakih 5 država, odnosno 22% zemalja svijeta, je ustavom ili zakonom određenu religiju proglasila zvaničnom religijom te države. Primjera radi, Anglikanska crkva ima status državne religije u Engleskoj, dok je katoličanstvo državna religija Malte. Nešto manji procenat, preciznije 20% zemalja svijeta, je ustavom ili zakonom dodijelilo preferencijalan status nekoj religiji. Primjera radi, Luteranska crkva u Danskoj, Norveškoj i Švedskoj uživa preferencijalan status u odnosu na druge. Ipak, većina zemalja, odnosno 53% zemalja svijeta, nema državnu religiju niti dodjeljuje privilegiran status bilo kojoj od njih. Francuska je jedan primjer, iako i u toj zemlji katolička crkva uživa brojne privilegije u odnosu na druge. Na kraju, manji procenat zemalja, odnosno njih 5%, je neprijateljski i restriktivno nastrojen prema religiji. Kina, Kuba, Kazahstan, Azerbejdžan, Sjeverna Koreja, Vijetnam i Turkmenistan su samo neke od tih zemalja. Detaljnije o Europi, njenoj kulturi i identitetu pojašnjava nam profesor Joachim Burdack iz Leipziga. Professor Burdack, once again, hello and welcome to Al Jazeera Balkans, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on here.
Now, we often talk about Europe's history, Europe's identity, and in European values, but what is Europe anyways?
Well, there are different answers to your question, I'm afraid. The most simple one and straightforward is, of course, that Europe is a continent, one of the 6 or 7 continents that the world has. But as you can see, if you can be talking about 6 or 7, or when I was a child, we were talking about 5 continents in the world. The Olympic rings, there were 5 continents. So you can see there also that even this concept of a continent is flexible in a way. And so if you talk about Europe as a continent, you also have to say that in a certain way, the most basic definition of a continent is that of a mass of land surrounded by water. And this, of course, is not true for Europe because it forms one big mass with Asia, so it's a European Asian continent. So as a continent, you could have Europe, and people have agreed on certain limits of Europe, like they divide a pie, they have agreed of, well, this is where Asia starts, this is where Europe starts, but these things are not obvious, they're not natural, but they are negotiated, they're results of discourses. This would be the first simple answer, Europe as a continent. But Europe is also, in a more general way, there are certain ideas that are connected to Europe. People say that there are things that are typical European or that Europe stands for. These are also discussed. You could say that, for instance, some people say that the movement of enlightenment, the philosophy of enlightenment, the idea of universal human rights that was developed in the 18th century in Europe and culminated in the French Revolution and the Declaration of Human Rights is something typical European.
But where exactly are the borders of Europe? In Vladivostok or in Istanbul?
This is always a question posed to geographers, and geographers can only say it depends, because it depends on what you are talking about. There is no natural, especially in the East, no natural border of Europe. There are only conventions, and the current convention that you find in geography books is that of that Europe ends at the Ural Mountains, the Ural River, and the Caspian Sea. But this is something that was sort of created or imposed in the 18th century. Before that, there were definitions of Europe that were much more restricted. The line, the eastern border of Europe, was much more from for instance, from the Black Sea to the Ladoga Sea to the White Sea in the north, so much more restricted. And it was only actually, there was the influence of Tsar Peter the Great, the Russian Tsar, who wanted to include Moscow and his new capital, St. Petersburg, into notions of Europe, that he held as prisoner a Swedish geographer, von Strahlenberg, and he came up with this Ural mountain border of the east. So even there in these features, they are not natural, but there are ideas behind it, there are interests behind it, there are negotiations and discourses behind that.
Now, does Europe have a Judeo-Christian heritage, and if so, how important is this to Europe's cultural and religious identity?
Of course, Christianity and Judaism are part of European heritage, but they are not I would not say that they are the exclusive heritage. So you have sort of at the origin important are also the Roman heritage, especially what we inherited from them, the Roman administration, the Roman law, which has been very influential. You have the influence of Greek philosophy on Europe. So you have these antique movement, and then you have Christianity coming into play, and of course with the Renaissance you also have secular movements like the Enlightenment movement, philosophy that is not so much based on religion. So much of what makes Europe as a continent is not always one thing, but opposite things. It is sort of the Christianity, but also Enlightenment thinking. They are struggling for how societies in Europe should be organized, and it's just also some people say that you have a productive capitalism, market economy as one of the principal things, but you also have the opposition to that, socialism coming in Europe, and these constant opposing forces is what really make Europe, I think.
To what extent have Muslims and the presence of Islam in Spain, Portugal, and Italy, and in the Balkans since the 15th century have contributed to Europe's identity?
There has been a long history of exchange and interaction between Muslim countries, or people from a Muslim background, and Europe. And as you especially mentioned, in the Middle Ages, and Europe profited very much from that exchange. Many things that we take as typical European came to Europe via this exchange. Certain plants, for instance, lemons, oranges, rice, spices even from further away. But not only that, certain techniques, agricultural techniques, the Arabs introduced irrigation agriculture on the Iberian Peninsula. Other very important things like medicine, pharmaceutical things, much of it the Europeans profited from the exchange to the Muslim countries. For instance, many of the pharmacies in Germany are still named Mohrenapotheke. The name Moor coming from Moor from the Arabs in the Moorish Iberian Peninsula, and so this was considered as a sign of quality. We have this sort of medicine that comes from there. This is now forgotten, and now just as a side note, some people that think they are anti-racist protest against the name Mohrenapotheke because they think the name Moor is degrading in a way, but actually it wasn't that. It was sort of just one thing that acknowledges that it came from the Moors, and it was something that was a predicate of appreciation for that. Other things that you don't think of in the first place, that were probably not invented in the Islamic countries, but came via this vast mass of Islamic countries to Europe. Paper, for instance. What would Europe be, the European Enlightenment movement? What would be, here we are in Germany, the Reformation of of Martin Luther be without paper and printed paper, and the paper came also.
All right, Professor Burdack, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Državne religije imaju uloge koje su uglavnom simbolične prirode. Ipak, često su opipljive razlike i prednosti vezano za zakonski ili porezni status, vlasništvo nad nekretninama ili financijsku pomoć države. Ipak, većina zemalja u svijetu je neutralna kada je riječ o religiji. Poštovani gledalci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju Granica istoka. Emisiju možete gledati na našoj internetskoj stranici balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.